In the last episode, we saw how France's ambitions for exploration and empire began to take shape. But before ships sailed and colonies were founded, there was an entire world within France itself, a society defined by kings, nobles, priests, and common people. To truly understand French colonization, we first need to understand France at home. Hello, friends, and welcome back to our series on French colonization. In the first episode, we explored France's ambitions to expand overseas, the explorers, the trade routes, the role of religion, and the early struggles of New France. But to understand why France pursued colonies so fiercely, we must look inward, at France itself, before colonization truly began. What kind of society produced these ambitions? How were power, religion, and law structured? And how did ordinary people live in a world shaped by kings, nobles, and the church? In this episode, we'll uncover the roots of French society, its feudal system, its social inequalities, and its religious tensions that laid the foundation for the colonial empire to come. France was originally known as the Roman province of Gaul. After the fall of the Roman Empire, it was conquered by a Germanic tribe known as the Franks. Clovis of Firmisern was the Frankish leader who became the first king of France in the late 5th century. Before colonization, France had a complex history, evolving from the Roman province of Gaul through the Frankish kingdom and into the Kingdom of France. Pre-colonial French society was largely agrarian, with a feudal structure and diverse regional identities. Social and economic inequalities, particularly between the peasantry and the nobility, were significant, contributing to the tensions that eventually led to the French Revolution. France was initially defined as the western area of Germany, known as Rhineland, but it later came to refer to a territory that was known as Gaul during the Iron Age in ancient Roman era. Feudalism in France emerged as a system of governance and social hierarchy following the decline of the Carolingian Empire and the subsequent Viking invasions. It was driven by the need for local protection and stability in the face of external threats and internal power struggles. The system was shaped by powerful nobles who, in exchange for military service and loyalty, controlled land and granted rights to vassals and peasants. In France, it is widely believed that Charles Martel, often cited as a key figure in the development of feudalism, granted land to nobles who served in his military, establishing a lord-vassal relationship. Society was organized around a feudal system where peasants worked the land owned by nobles and the church. This system created a hierarchical structure with limited social mobility. The feudal system created a strict social hierarchy where power was concentrated among kings, nobles, knights, and peasants. At the top were kings who granted land to nobles in exchange for loyalty and military support. Nobles then divided their land among knights who provided protection. After the breakup of the Carolingian Empire, a strong central authority was absent, leading to a decentralized system where local lords gained power. Frequent Viking raids created a need for local protection, prompting nobles to build fortifications and raise armies. Feudalism was built on the control of land, with lords granting land, fiefs, to vassals in exchange for military service and loyalty. Structure was divided into different categories as we've spoken before. The power was divided like this. Charlemagne was a strong European emperor, responsible for feudal structure to implement. His vast empire and need for governance led to the granting of lands to local leaders, ensuring their loyalty and forming a structured hierarchy. Nobles, they controlled land, granted it to vassals, and provided protection and justice within their territories. Vassals, nobles who held land from a lord in exchange for service and loyalty. Peasants, they worked the land and provided labor and agricultural products to the lord. All power came through the king. While the king was at the top of the feudal structure, his power was often challenged by powerful nobles. In essence, feudalism in France was a response to the political, social, and military conditions of the time, creating a system where power was decentralized and based on land ownership and reciprocal obligations. Before the start of its colonial period, France was characterized by a predominantly rural society. In the early modern period, a vast majority of the French population, at least 96%, lived in rural areas and were engaged in agriculture. France had the largest population in Europe at the time, but this population was largely dispersed across the countryside. Despite the rural focus, France had a significant population, making it a major power in Europe. While rural dominance was a general trend, there were regional differences in agricultural practices and social structures. France was not a unified nation-state in the modern sense. Different regions had their own laws, customs, and even languages, leading to a sense of local identity alongside a broader French identity. While the nobility and clergy enjoyed wealth and privilege, the peasantry faced poverty and hardship. Rising bread prices during periods of famine could lead to social unrest and riots. With a rigid social hierarchy where the privileged clergy and nobility enjoyed exemptions from taxes, while the third estate, commoners, bore the brunt of the tax burden. This disparity, coupled with economic hardship and financial crisis, fueled popular discontent. As nobles and clergy were the privileged orders, they were exempt from such direct taxes as the taille or land tax. Most taxes were paid by the third estate, a class that included peasants, artisans, merchants, and professional men. The Catholic Church played a significant role in French society, both politically and culturally. Its influence extended to education, social welfare, and even political affairs. As spoken earlier, France was overwhelmingly Catholic, deeply intertwined with the state and society. This influence was so strong that France was often called the eldest daughter of the Church. However, France also experienced religious tensions, particularly with the Protestant Reformation, which led to conflicts like the Wars of Religion, and later the Edict of Nantes aimed to provide tolerance. In 1598, the edict granted limited religious freedom to Huguenots, aiming to end the conflict between Catholics and Protestants, but it was eventually revoked. While deeply connected to the Catholic Church, the French monarchy also asserted some control, particularly in the appointment of bishops, a policy known as Gallicanism. The Protestant Reformation significantly impacted France, leading to the rise of the Huguenots, French Protestants, and sparking religious wars. Despite the Edict of Nantes, religious tensions persisted, with ongoing persecution and conflicts throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. The Catholic Church was the largest landowner, controlled vast properties, collected tithes, and was heavily involved in education and social services. From 1880 to 1914, tens of thousands of men and women left France for distant religious missions, driven by the desire to spread the word of Jesus Christ, combat Satan, and convert the world's pagans to Catholicism. Practically, churches were involved in everybody's private life as well. The commercialization and abuse of power granted by religion were misused not only in France, but in their upcoming colonies as well. Although in history, Crusaders were also religious warriors who did the same, mostly from France, England, and other of today's European nations. While large-scale colonization came later, France did engage in early exploration and trade, including voyages to North America and the establishment of trading posts. In essence, pre-colonial France was a society marked by stark social and economic divisions, a strong feudal structure, and regional diversity, all under the influence of the Catholic Church and the monarchy. Before colonization, French law and enforcement were characterized by a mix of local customs, regional customals, and royal decrees. There was no single unified legal code. The marechaussee, initially a military policing force, later extended its reach to civilian matters. The French legal system was significantly reformed during the Revolution, leading to the Napoleonic Code and a more centralized system. Before the Napoleonic Code, French law was not unified. Instead, it was a patchwork of local customs documented in customals, like the Custom of Paris and royal decrees or charters. In the High Middle Ages, legal situations were largely determined by local customs and practices within communities. From the 12th century onwards, Roman law became a subject of scholarly study, but its practical application, especially in the north, was limited. France began as a kingdom in 987 and grew through wars and expansions into a powerful nation. The French Revolution overthrew the monarchy in 1789, leading to a republic and many political changes. Famous leaders like Louis XIV, Napoleon, and de Gaulle shaped France's rich history of monarchies and republics. Thank you for watching my video. Your subscription and commenting, liking and sharing means a lot to me. Exploring French colonization. This was France before it started colonization. Everything was a mess as judiciary, law and enforcement, rule of the jungle one can say, was in France. Power structure and monarchy with religious mix-up, hunger and dream of big nations, trade, raw material, or growing it at less cost for the local population's life. Keeping jobs secure in France were most causes of French colonization. See you in the first episode starting next week. Until then, take care of yourself. Let us understand the difference between colonization and colonialism, because many of us really don't understand the real meaning of it. Colonization is the physical act of colonialism. In simple words, colonialism is the policy of expanding into, annexing territories, other countries for the use of its resources and geography for another country. But never forget these three G words. God, gold, and glory motivated European nations to explore and create colonies in the New World. Unfortunately, these were only words. As ex-Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta said, "Whites brought us the Bible to read. While we were reading, they occupied our land." In this episode, we shall talk about French governance over occupied countries and territories. However, the leaders spearheading the movement cited the white man's burden, a term popularized in Rudyard Kipling's poem, to morally justify imperialist expansion. The philosophy underpinning the white man's burden consisted of the three C's of colonialism: civilization, Christianity, and commerce. When we hear all this, we smile today, but life at that time was not so fast, and information was not able to spread as it does today. Always the cunning play well, more than the ordinary person, or the person who has no reach to information technology, and their myths and visions were locally biased. The 7 L's include labor, land, liberty, life, love, language, and legacy. These were known and spread by all colonial powers in the early spreading of colonialism. France controlling ways of colonized nations and territories. Conversely, it has been argued that Christianity played a central role in colonial efforts, allowing Christian missionaries to colonize the conscience and consciousness of Africans, thus instilling the belief that any non-Christian spiritual ideas are inferior to Christianity, echoing the colonial hierarchical view. French colonization mechanisms involved a combination of direct rule, military force, economic exploitation, and cultural assimilation, all designed to maintain control over its colonies. This included establishing administrative structures, extracting resources, and attempting to reshape societies in the image of France. France implemented a system of direct rule, placing French administrators in positions of power to govern colonies, often sidelining or replacing existing local leadership. Colonies were ruled, on the one hand, through decrees issued by 2 different ministries, the Ministry of the Interior and the Colonial Office, in Paris, and, on the other hand, by executive orders that made the representative of the French government the main source of the law. French direct rule in its colonies had several negative effects, including the suppression of local cultures and traditions, the exploitation of resources and labor, and the creation of political and social structures that favored French interests over those of the indigenous population. Additionally, the imposition of French systems of governance often led to resentment and resistance from local populations. French colonies were often exploited for their natural resources and labor, with little regard for the well-being of the local population. This included forced labor, unfair taxation, and the extraction of valuable resources without fair compensation. The imposition of French rule often led to political instability and conflict, as local populations resisted the loss of their autonomy and the imposition of foreign rule. This could manifest as rebellions, uprisings, and long-term political tensions. While some infrastructure and development projects were undertaken in French colonies, they often served French interests rather than the needs of the local population. This could lead to uneven development and exacerbate existing inequalities. Even after decolonization, the legacy of French direct rule continued to shape the political, social, and economic landscape of many former colonies. This can include ongoing inequalities, political instability, and a continued dependence on France in some areas. The question is ambiguous. It seems to be asking about the role of white French soldiers in colonial military forces. During the colonial period, white soldiers were a significant part of French colonial armies, often holding officer positions and leading troops primarily composed of indigenous soldiers. This presence was a key element in maintaining French control over its colonies. France, like other European powers, relied on colonial troops to both project power and maintain order within its vast empire. These troops were often recruited from the local populations, such as the Senegalese tirailleurs, but were commanded by French officers who were predominantly white. The French officer corps in the colonies was largely composed of white soldiers. They were responsible for training, leading, and administering the colonial forces. Military conquest and the threat of force were crucial tools for establishing and maintaining control. The famous Treaty of Amity and Commerce promoted trade between the United States and France and recognized the United States as an independent nation. Between 1778 and 1782, the French provided supplies, arms and ammunition, uniforms, and, most importantly, troops and naval support to the beleaguered Continental Army. France extracted vast amounts of natural resources from its colonies and used their economies to benefit the mother country, often through forced labor and unequal trade practices. The French established a series of trading posts rather than extensive settlements, focusing on economic partnerships with indigenous peoples. French colonizers often intermarried with indigenous groups, creating alliances that were crucial for trade and military support. A bad example of it: poor living conditions, famines, and disease made enslaved labor conditions particularly lethal across French colonies. French presence in Senegal began in 1626, although formal colonies and trading posts were not established until 1659 with the founding of Saint Louis and 1677 with the founding of Gorée. French colonialism aimed to spread French language, culture, and education, often suppressing indigenous traditions and languages. The French Empire was based on the fur trade in this region and required Native American alliances to sustain it. Native people in the French traded, lived together, and often married each other and built families together. However, in Arabic-speaking regions and in Africa, this was not the case. In Arabic and African regions, for marriage, you can rarely find an example in the early years of colonization of France. Mostly, they were treated as second-class citizens and ruled by the Ministry of Colonies, for example. France sometimes exploited existing ethnic or social divisions to weaken resistance and maintain control. Enslaved African persons under French rule were governed by a brutal enslavement code known as the Code Noir, which enforced a race-based social and political hierarchy and enabled the forced labor of Africans in the Americas. However, On April 27, 1848, the proclamation of the abolition of slavery in the French colonies was made. The effective abolition was enacted with the decree abolishing slavery of April 27, 1848. The island of Martinique was the first French overseas colony where the decree actually came into force on May 23, 1848. Slavery typically involves compulsory work, with the slave's location of work and residence dictated by the party that holds them in bondage. Enslavement is the placement of a person into slavery, and the person is called a slave or an enslaved person. Throughout Africa, French rule was characterized by sharp contradictions between a rhetorical commitment to the civilization of indigenous people through cultural, political, and economic reform, and the harsh realities of violent conquest, economic exploitation, legal inequality, and sociocultural disruption. There were certain treaties with nations in favor of France, actually, and I can say it was a tactic of divide and rule. In the mid-1600s, the Huron were driven from their traditional territories around Georgian Bay. In 1701, this tumultuous era came to an end when France and 40 First Nations signed a treaty in Montreal known as the Great Peace. While some infrastructure projects were undertaken, they often served to facilitate resource extraction and control rather than benefit the local population. French colonial law often favored French settlers and discriminated against the indigenous population. Even after formal independence, France maintained significant influence over its former colonies through economic dependence, political alliances, and military interventions. Despite French control, colonized people developed various strategies to resist or cope with French rule. Individuals and groups sought ways to gain more influence within the colonial system. People adapted, reinterpreted, or resisted French cultural influence. People developed strategies to survive and adapt to the disruptions caused by colonial rule. Some individuals and communities navigated the complex legal systems to their benefit. France had about 80 colonies throughout its history, the second most colonies in the world behind only the British Empire. Around 40 countries gained independence from France throughout its history, the second most in the world behind only the British Empire. France's participation in the transatlantic and transoceanic slave trade, profits from the exploitation of African slaves on cotton plantations in its North American colonies and on sugarcane plantations in the Caribbean islands, contributed more to the primary accumulation of capital. The harvesting of furs created wealth, stimulated the exploration of the continent, and created alliances with many Aboriginal peoples. Prior to its independence, Haiti was a French colony known as Saint-Domingue. Saint-Domingue's slave-based sugar and coffee industries had been fast-growing and successful, and by the 1760s, it had become the most profitable colony in the Americas. Europeans brought technology, such as railways and mining techniques, and integrated their colonies more fully into world trade, taking advantage of existing patterns of comparative advantage. As I said earlier, it was not mostly for indigenous people. These were built for their interests. Europeans brought technology, such as railways and mining techniques, and integrated their colonies more fully into world trade, taking advantage of existing patterns of comparative advantage. Only 2 African states remain independent: Ethiopia, Abyssinia, and Liberia, although Liberia is often considered an informal colony of the United States. Not French, British, Spanish, Portuguese, or German colonies. However, Italy tried to occupy Ethiopia but failed, according to historians. The reason behind this is found in an age-long sound agricultural structure, enabled by favorable environmental conditions, and a concomitant age-long process of state formation. The French economy relied heavily on agriculture, trade, and the production of luxury goods, and the power and influence of the monarchy played a significant role in shaping economic policies and development. France probably could have become the leading European colonial power in the 17th and 18th centuries. It had the largest population and wealth, the best army while Louis XIV ruled, and, for a time in his reign, the strongest navy. Humans can never be enslaved, but today's harsh reality is all major powers are doing the same as they did in their past. Only the methods change. Now economy, lending, and controlling nations with technologies, modern warfare, and financial institutes of the world. Thank you for watching my video. Your subscription, liking, and sharing means a lot to me. It keeps me motivated to find interesting topics to bring on your devices. Until the next interesting and informative video, have a good time. Take care of yourself. Bye-bye.